Well, welcome to this online session with Work with Purpose entitled Defining Generosity, Differences Among Generations. We're thrilled that you can be with us here today, and we're looking forward to this time together. My name is Justin Irving, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I serve Bethel Seminary in a variety of different roles, one of which is engaging with our Work with Purpose initiative, and would like to highlight a few dynamics about Work with Purpose. What is Work with Purpose? Really, Work with Purpose aims to nurture biblical and theological reflection on the intersection of faith, work, and economics. Really, it's our heartbeat to equip pastors and Christian leaders in their various ministry and work contexts in order to empower other people, the people of their churches and their communities, with a vision of what we call whole life discipleship. Not just a discipleship that's on Sunday morning or Wednesday night, but a discipleship that connects to every dimension of their lives, Sunday through Saturday, and helping to have a mindset that views all of life in light of God's priorities in this world. I want to highlight for you a feature that we have in this presentation format. It's a place for you to add your questions and comments into the discussions. We'll be interacting with our speaker in a moment, hearing perspectives on generosity and generations, and some questions or comments might arise for you as we're going through that presentation. We'll have time for question and answer kind of embedded in the midst of the conversation, but also we'll have a Q&A time at the end of the presentation as well. We invite you to use this chat feature, which you can find by clicking on the icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen entitled Chat, and that's where you can share your questions and comments with us that we'll engage as we have time at the end of this presentation. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to our speaker for the day, Leif Erickson, who is the community engagement leader with Thrivent Financial. And I've had a chance to hear Leif speak before on this theme of generosity, and I can affirm that you all are in for a treat as we engage in learning together about this important dimension of finance and generosity, both in our own lives and in the lives of the generations around us. When we speak about whole life discipleship, it includes these conversations of generosity and finance. And so we're thankful to have experts like Leif join us in this online session. So Leif, thanks for being here, and I'll hand things over to you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Irving. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We are going to be talking about a topic of engaging generations through generosity. And a couple of questions I want to kick us off with is, how would your ministry be impacted if you had insider information on how others think about this topic of generosity? How would your leadership be affected? Well, we're not going to be able to answer those two questions in whole today with the time that we have, but I do hope to begin us on a journey where we can begin to see some of the impact and perhaps start on that journey of answering those questions. For those that are unfamiliar with Thrivent Financial, real quickly, we are a membership organization of Christians who wants to help people be wise with money so they can live more generously and impact the communities in which they live. That's our heartbeat. And it's from that heartbeat that we commissioned Barna Research Group in 2016 to do some research for us on this topic of generosity as it relates to U.S. Christians across all generations. Based on that research, we actually developed a 3-hour interactive workshop for church leaders that at the end of our time together, I'll actually have a slide that highlights the different cities across the country where those workshops are taking place this fall. And this version of it is just a tip of the iceberg to get us started on this conversation. As we go through it, I want you to think about the word empathy. Large organizations spend tremendous amount of resources on empathy research so they can better understand the people they're trying to reach with their mission. I think that is a great way to think about this material as we think about trying to reach the generations that are before us for this mission of Christ. So empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings and experiences of another. Now the challenge for us is as we begin to take a peek at what some of these other generations are thinking about this word generosity, is for us to fall back into a position of saying, how could they possibly think that? That's a real challenge, and I want us to keep that in mind as we go through this material, and as you perhaps engage with it on a deeper level, should you take have the ability to go through that interactive workshop. Because what we found when we saw this research was pretty profound in just how different generations really think about this topic. I know it was very revealing for me as I was exposed to this material, and it's certainly impacted some of the ways that I've tried to live out my own generosity. And so think about this from a discipleship standpoint. Our goal today is really to uncover, and we'll slide to the next slide here. There we go. Our goal today is to share insights about what U.S. Christians really think about generosity for the purpose of building empathy. And that last sentence, I think, is what's so important in order to disciple and engage all generations. There's some major headwinds that we know through our own research facing the church today. Those two headwinds, as we hear from pastors all across the country, is that people are generally not giving financially the way they used to, and younger generations aren't coming back to church the way the previous generations have. And so that's just a couple of things I want to put out there. We understand that as an organization through our own engagement with multiple, hundreds of pastors from multiple different denominations. So really part of this work is to think about it from a discipleship standpoint. Now, real quickly, you do have a 3-page handout. There's a couple blanks on there. So if you enjoy learning that way, interactively by writing down, there's a few blanks. I'll try my best to make sure that we capture those. But at the very end of the day, we'll actually give those answers to you if you tend towards being an analytic like myself and want to make sure you capture all the information. So with that, let's dive into the research. We're going to start first in this space. Oh, real quickly, thank you. There's 3 considerations when we're thinking about generosity that I want us to keep in mind. Number 1, generosity always costs us something. Generosity always has a cost to it. Secondly, generosity can be born out of scarcity. It can be born out of a sense of scarcity. And finally, it can be born out of a sense of surplus. So a generous act is always going to have 2 of those 3 things generally in place. There's always going to be a cost. It might be out of scarcity, or it could be out of one's surplus. All right, so let's dive into the numbers. So state of financial giving, there's just a couple of data points we'll share here today with you. First one is taking a look at self-reported donations in 2015. So keep in mind, we did the research in 16. The question was, how much did you give last year? And millennials, 84% of them said they gave less than $50 to any church or charity in 2015. 56% of all Christians in the poll said they gave less than $50 to church or charity in 2015. Why? What's behind that? Now, we don't have the time, obviously, in this format and time allocated this morning to uncover that. I think that there's multiple different reasons. Some are spiritual, that you on the other line would probably know better than myself. Some of them are going to be emotional in nature, and some of them are going to be logical. Those are really the 3 different dimensions, generally speaking, that we found that motivations arise out of: spiritual, emotional, and logical. I want to take a little bit of time and narrow in on one logical space, and that's the topic of debt. We uncovered in the study that personal debt is a huge to significant problem. Now, in a moment, I'm going to have you interact with the chat feature. So if you haven't found that yet, on the bottom of your screen, I'm going to invite you to take a moment to look at that, because I'm curious from your perspective, in addition to debt, what might some of the other practical reasons people, are keeping people from giving. So as we go through this information on debt, I want you to be thinking about some other practical things. But personal debt, we discovered in the research, is a huge and significant problem, not only for millennials, and you can see here that 34% of millennials responded that debt's a huge and significant problem. And of course, we think of that group of dealing with student loan debt. And on your handout, you'll see that there's a call out there. Student loan debt has now passed consumer debt at $1.5 trillion, which is a number I can hardly get my mind around. But it's also a major problem for our Generation Xers. In fact, 39% of our Generation Xers said that personal debt is a huge and significant problem. And even our baby boomers, those on the cusp of retirement, 31% said that debt is a huge to significant problem. In fact, I'll total about 35% of every Christian, 35% of all Christians in your church are dealing with serious debt below age 70. A couple other things. So what else can prevent someone from giving financially? This is where I'd love to see some feedback in the chat box. I'll take a moment. As we do that, keep in mind, if you're filling in the blanks, 35% of church attendees under age 70 dealing with debt. The average monthly student loan payment is now over $350 per month. Significant problems. But what else can prevent someone from giving financially? Yeah, folks don't see a direct connection between their giving and outcomes of that ministry. Great call out. Well, as more ideas are coming in, I'll give you some insights that we have discovered here at Thrivent. If you want to forward the slide, Tessa. We know that here's some other practical things that are going on in people's lives. Household income, yeah, some Roxanne said. Insecurity, yeah, very good. Unexpected expenses. How many people have had Christmas show up unexpectedly? I remember coaching a couple in my own personal ministry, and they were doing great at saving some money, getting $1,000 cash reserve. That was a goal we were chasing, just to help them kind of get off that debt Ferris wheel, or roller coaster, I should say. And next thing you know, their emergency reserve is gone, and you know, they're kind of back in a tough place emotionally as a couple. I said, what happened? And their response was, well, Christmas came. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, we knew that was coming for the last 12 months, right? So I don't know if that can fall under the unexpected expenses category, but there certainly are unexpected expenses in our lives. How about generally just having a lack of budget, or maybe a better word is a spending plan, which inevitably leads to spending more than you make. Many of us have maybe experienced that personally, or know others that have. Certainly some things can happen, like getting laid off or losing a job, lack of financial goals, you know, just having some real clarity about what the money's for. How about being in that boomer pinch? That certainly can be a big problem, where you're helping parents out, you're still helping your kids maybe get through college or whatever the situation is, and just generally navigating new stages of life. And we all, you know, can remember those different events: buying a house, you know, starting a new job, maybe getting a financial raise. Maybe you're in a commission job, and so you know you've got a great commission coming, and you spend it 2 or 3 times before it actually arrives. All those sorts of things can certainly happen. The question I have relative to this, and I think there's been some more things that have come in through the chat box, so thank you for that. Appreciate you participating. How, in your church, in your ministry, how do these things translate into opportunities to minister? We know that 35% of our folks are dealing with serious debt because of one or more of these realities in their life. How can we help, not just with the debt issue, but maybe helping them develop a budget, or planning for unexpected expenses, or navigating, you know, a child's birth, or a sudden loss of a spouse, or different things like that that happen, that we know happen on a daily basis. I like the way one pastor put it. He says, we spend a whole lot of time focusing on the 10%, right? Talking about the tithe. we're on the cusp of for many churches, a stewardship season where we're talking about stewardship and looking for those pledge cards. He says we spend a whole lot of time focusing on the 10%. How much time do we spend focusing on the other 90%? Do our people know that we care about the 90%? And this is from a bishop of the Full Gospel Baptist denomination. And I think that that's an important question to ask is, do we know? And if this was in a live setting, I would solicit your feedback on maybe how some of the ways that your church is ministering in those other areas. Just quickly moving forward, I would just ask you to maybe give that some personal reflection in how your church is helping people. And these are really, as we come back to Thrivent's mission and helping people be wise with money. And that's really what we're talking about here, is getting people on that wise with money journey. And so I hope that that's reflected in your church's ministry. And if not, maybe today's conversation is a kickstart for that. Well, I want to shift gears and to continue to talk about this topic of financial generosity, but go from the numbers to the reasons why. Generosity, why people give. Question was, what drives generosity, or why are you generous? And the response was that generosity is always driven by compassion. Well, I'm actually kind of encouraged by that. Obviously, through Christ's ministry, he demonstrated compassion on several occasions, which is fantastic. This is really born out of an emotional space versus a practical. I think that there's a pretty significant difference there between the pastors and the millennials. As we think back to those two challenges that I mentioned earlier, with young people not coming back to church and giving generally down, in thinking about it from the context of empathy, I think this is an important slide to wrestle with and recognize that nearly half of millennials that were a part of the poll, and I'll just say that those who were a part of the research project were Christians in the U.S. that were self-proclaimed that faith was important to them. So these weren't just anybody off the street, but these were folks that were vetted for attending church and saying that church was, or their faith was important to them. And they said that generosity is always driven by compassion. A question I think that's important to ask is, how does that coincide or fit with how all too many of us, I'll say a Generation Xer, and even the research showed that this is the way that pastors were thinking, is that generosity, financial giving, financial generosity is a discipline, that it's planned, and yet the laity talked about it being spontaneous and driven from emotion. And I think those are two important things to recognize, is that, well, we'd love to be able to plan and invite people into that process. And I think that that's a reasonable, and this is my opinion, I think that's a reasonable place to want to bring people to. 84% of millennials said they didn't give anything last year to church or charity, or less than $50. 56% of Christians said that they gave less than $50 to church or charity. And they're telling us, hey, we want to give out of spontaneity. We believe that generosity is always driven by compassion, or driven by generally emotion. And so I think that's just an important thing to recognize, that there's a big, big difference there. I like the way one pastor put it. Actually, it was a local pastor here in the Twin Cities that I've gotten a chance to know pretty well over the last year. He says, I don't ask for money. I tell stories. Because you gave, these things happened. When we share stories of ministry, it's less about the money and more about what God is up to. It becomes more about faith and less about money itself. So what I want to do now is, we're actually, Tess and I, we decided to kick off a polling question. So we want to hear from you. In the last 90 days, thinking about Pastor Ryan's quote about telling stories, in the last 90 days, have you shared a story of impact as a result of your church's giving? Let's take a moment, go ahead and click there, and Tessa will share the results with us here in just a moment. All right, our results. 53% said yes, in the last 90 days, their church has shared a story of impact as a result of their church's giving. 35% no, and 12% weren't sure. So here's the challenge. Thanks for that, Tessa, and thanks for your participation in that. So my challenge to you, and I don't know exactly what roles you play, obviously your ministries from pastors to laity, but see if you can't increase the storytelling that happens with the money that people give. I know that a lot of churches are going to a narrative annual report, but more importantly than an annual report would be that regular rhythm. We know that communication changes cultures. We know that communication impacts cultures. And so to the ability that we can implement and integrate more storytelling, helping people connect. And I know that one of the comments early on talked about people not seeing the connection between the dollars giving and the ministry happening. And that was a major data point that came out in the study, in the research study, is that people do want to see the impact. They want to know that the dollars they're giving are making an impact. And so to be able to do that, I think was only going to help move the dial and helping people live out their financial generosity in a more significant way. So thank you for that. I want to change the topic then from financial giving, and we're going to hit another topic of generosity, another area of generosity that's very, obviously happens in the church a lot, and that's service and volunteering. Another expression, that's the word I was looking for, another expression of generosity, service and volunteering. And what we found through the research was that there's a direct correlation between how people gave, like the level of giving, and how much they actually volunteered with the organization. And I think the thing, to recognize here, and it's probably pretty intuitive, is that people just feel invested in the organization. They feel invested in the cause. It's also a great way for them to see the impact of their giving, right? So percentage of attendees who gave $500 or more, you can see if they volunteered with at least within the last month or last week on a weekly basis, 35% or more. That's a pretty significant number. And if they're only volunteering once or twice a year, it looks like, within the last 6 months or more, then it really drops significantly. So, obviously a good question to ask is, can you develop financial givers through volunteering by helping people make that connection with the right place to volunteer, whether it be the nursery or whatever the case would be in your organization? And I think the answer is yes, that in order to build up and foster new financial giving, get them invested in their hands in doing the work of the ministry through volunteering. A third area or third expression of the research that we want to take a look at is really what we would consider an emerging trend, and that's hospitality. And this was defined, financial giving and volunteering, they're pretty easy to measure in the church or organizations. This one's a little bit tougher. As I do the workshop, I invite people to share with me how much hospitality is happening in their church or, within the body of believers that they represent inside or outside the church. And it's pretty difficult to do. But for our research, we defined hospitality, or Barna defined it as openness, welcome, unqualified acceptance, lack of judgment, and kindness towards another. And with millennials, this was a major expression of generosity. What I found interesting is looking at the boomers and elders. Single digits in terms of saying hospitality is how they would define generosity. Now, does that mean that they're not generous? Well, of course not. I remember going to my grandma's house every Sunday afternoon, and there was always food, and she was more than happy to have us. I just think that generation thought of hospitality a little bit differently. I think a good question to ask, thinking about when we talked earlier about generosity always costing us something, and it can be born out of surplus or born out of scarcity. I wonder, what does hospitality cost us? Now, you don't need to worry about putting it in the chat. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to give a response it's in that alignment. But if we know that financial giving, there's a cost, right? If I give you 50, it costs me 50. And that could be born out of scarcity, it could be born out of surplus. But with hospitality, what's the cost here? Let's take a look at this quote from Caitlin, a 23-year-old, that was a part of our research. She says, "I believe hospitality best describes how I'm generous with others. In my actions, I always strive to display Christ's love, unconditional acceptance. With limited resources of time and money, this is a gift that I feel is the best way I show generosity." So in the chat, I want to invite you to respond. What's the cost here for Caitlin? What does hospitality cost her? While you're doing that, I'm looking at the chats and I see that someone has a question about the research. Sample of the study. All right, I will track that down. But I don't have that for us here today. I will get that to Tessa and she can send it with the follow-up information. All right, anybody want to weigh in on what the cost of hospitality is here for Caitlin? And the follow-up question I'll ask, and you don't need to respond on that one, but in filling in the blanks, what's the driver of generosity for Caitlin? What's the driver? So what's it cost her, and what's the driver? Surplus or scarcity? All right, what do we got here? Time, energy, emotion. There is also financial cost if she's inviting them into her home for a meal. Thank you for that. Time, emotional energy. Yeah. But these are great answers, and I thank you for your input and your participation. You know, I think the thing that she calls out here is unconditional acceptance. Going right back to the definition of hospitality, unqualified acceptance. She's making room in her heart, isn't she, for others? And you're right, if she is inviting people in to her home, obviously there's some costs associated with that. The driver of generosity here for Caitlin, I think, is scarcity. She says with limited resources of time and money. So she is living out generosity in the form of hospitality because of limited time and limited financial resources. The question I think that's important to wrestle with on this is for that millennial, in this case, Caitlin, who has limited time, limited financial resources. Number one, I think the research shows us that there is, certainly, the different expressions of generosity are tied to where people are at in life. Service and volunteering, is pretty tough for the Generation X, according to the research. And why? Well, because they're raising kids and they're chasing them all over, the countryside. I fall into that group. Where the boomers and the elders have a little bit more time on their hands, so they feel like they can live in that space easier. Millennials working 1-2 jobs, trying to pay off student loan debt, might be feeling really tight, and so they can be hospitable to one another. And so certainly that's a part of it. But as leaders, as church leaders, can we let them off the hook? Are they, this is a strong word, but are they absolved from giving financially and for participating in that expression of generosity? And I think the answer would clearly be no, that we want to, and that's part of the intention of this research, is we want to help develop them as, complete followers of Christ in every way. And so to let Caitlin off from participating, I think that would be a shortcoming for her. Just like for myself, my primary expression of generosity is writing a check. I would rather give financially than be hospitable. That's not my go-to expression. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't develop that in that space. And so I think we all could probably identify what is our primary expression of generosity, whether it be financial giving or hospitality or service. But I think the challenge for us in that as church leaders is to meet people where they are, recognize that, encourage them in that, but also then develop them in that. One of the other studies or case study, I'll say, in the workshop, the full-blown workshop, is we look at an example where there is a call from the pulpit. There's a conversation from the pulpit around financial giving, around generosity, I should say. And so that millennial in the pew hears that message and says, yeah, I want to participate. And so is more intentional about inviting friends over, making them meals and serving, brothers and sisters in that respect. Well, no participation in the giving to the church. And so the challenge there is, have they become more generous? Well, of course they have, but perhaps not in the way that the church was looking for, or that church leader was looking for, in order to help carry out the ministry of the church. And so I think that's the real rub for us in this. And so we, I'll just leave it there. I think it's something to wrestle with. Again, we have an opportunity here to get a peek, an insider look to what others are thinking, what other generations are thinking about this. Our goal is to be more empathetic and use that research, use this knowledge to meet them where they're at and bring them along, as well as to recognize maybe some of our own blind spots. And speaking of myself, with my go-to being financial giving. Well, let's move forward. Here at Thrivent, we actually done quite a bit of research in this space, and we discovered there's 5 major expressions of generosity that came out through the research and other research that we've done. We've just touched the tip of the iceberg on some of these. We talked about monetary giving, just a couple of data points there. We talked a little bit about hospitality. We talked a little bit about service and volunteering. 2 of the other expressions are non-financial gift giving and emotional relational support, which ironically, I just want to make sure I get this right. Emotional relational support was identified by the U.S. Christians in the study as their second most preferred way to express generosity. It's easy to measure dollars given to the church. Right? We have a requirement to do that. It's fairly easy to measure volunteering and service. We can see that if there's Sunday school teachers or not, or whatever the case might be. The rest of these are a lot tougher to measure. And one of the things that we work towards in the workshop is to help churches think about what is their culture of generosity. And you can even begin to wrestle with this a little bit yourself based on what I've shared with you today. What is the culture of generosity like at your church, in your ministry? What's talked about? Is it giving and service, which is so easy to do? Is it hospitality or emotional relational support? And how does that even show up? Those are some of the things that we wrestle with, and would love to have you partner with us or participate with us in going deeper in this research to really understand the depth of that and where people are at. So I think if we're going to go forward, Tessa, this is the title, Engaging Generations Through Generosity. It is an interactive workshop. This is a very non-interactive medium today we're doing, but we do have a very interactive workshop experience over a 3-hour jam-packed, fast-paced that is really geared towards church leaders. I've had some nonprofit leaders come, and they can translate some of this stuff back into their nonprofits, but the workshop truly was engineered for the church space to be digested by church leaders. And we have a slide of where some of those locations are coming up at. So you can see here in Minnesota, we've got one coming up November 1, for those on the line from the local area. November 1st is our next one. I know that we got a nice partnership with Bethel out in San Diego, and so we'll be doing that same workshop in 2019, not till February. There was too many other things on the calendar. But wherever you're plugging in from across the country, we've got workshops coming up this fall, and you can find them and get registered at that generosityworkshop.com website right there. So with that, I'm going to pause and just ask Tessa, were there any questions that you wanted me to try to address that came through the chat? I wasn't able to keep up with those as well. And so if there's anything that you want me to try to address, or Dr. Irvin, if you have something, that would be a great help.
Sure. Yeah, happy to kind of field some of the questions and point them your way. Leif, thanks so much for this broad overview of the generosity research with Thrivent, and great to hear some stats-oriented questions asking about sample sizes and all that. We'll, of course, you'll be able to track that down and pass things along. Yes. I'm just going to kind of work with some of the more recent questions and then kind of work up, and then also invite people as we're talking, as more questions come to mind, as you've been exposed to these different pathways of generosity that surfaced in this research with Barna and Thrivent. What are some of the questions or topics of interest for you? Please jot a note in the chat feature, and we'll get to hear some reflections from Leif on that. So one of our more recent questions, Leif, says, how does the financial tithe figure into a definition of generosity? And you expressed kind of these 5 broad categories of generosity. Maybe you can interact with how the tithe engages those 5 expressions that you've noted for us.
Yeah, so the 5 expressions of generosity, as we highlighted the financial giving, which obviously is where the tithe would fall in. And then we have service, hospitality, non-financial gift giving. So that's where you're preparing a meal for another or passing along a book. And then finally, emotional and relational support. The research itself didn't get deep into the topic of the tithe. Really, it was more broad-based about just what are people doing as it relates to that financial giving. And so you saw that one slide where we talked about the different percentages of people that gave at those different levels. On the far right, where people responded they gave $2,500 or more. I know many churches think of the tithe, as around that $5,000 mark. Knowing just here in the Twin Cities, average household income of about $56,000 on average. The question there was $2,500 or more. So it wasn't, are you giving a tithe, but just a little bit more broad-based than that.
One comment that we received a bit ago noted that the structure or offer of financial management classes to foster financial planning from a Christian perspective was, they talked about that as one of the factors that maybe contributes to increased debt. You have some experience with that background. Any comments that you'd have on the value of such classes for churches and church leaders?
Yeah, thanks. My background is pretty deep in that area around working with churches to help them develop what I call their stewardship education ministries. And it really goes deep in helping the people in the pew kind of understand the art and science of handling their personal finances from a biblical perspective. We certainly, as part of our bread and butter here at Thrivent in terms of helping people be wise with money. And I'm looking forward to doing several workshops this fall, even at several different churches. Personally, everywhere, everything from just basic financial management, like, setting smart goals, navigating credit, dealing with debt, determining or, identifying needs versus wants, just helping people recognize that. And I'd love to see more churches do that. There's a lot of great resources out there. Thrivent would love to be a partner, but there's a lot of great, content out there. Mm-hmm. Key is to really find something that fits your church Christian education culture. If you have a small group model of doing primarily Christian education, you want a resource that's going to fit that. If you have a church that's used to doing workshops, 1 to 2 hour workshops, then let's find something that fits that bill. But more than anything, I want to see I would love to see more churches do more in that space. We hear, how many, thousands of messages every day that we need more, want more, right? This is a consumer-driven culture. We are rich in this country. And so to not handle our finances well, it impacts our relationship with Christ. It impacts every aspect of our life. Money intersects with every arena of life, whether it's your health, your recreation, your walk with the Lord, your walk with your spouse if you're married. It's just no area of life that finances doesn't touch. And so I would love to see the church be a champion in that space of helping people really help develop that spending plan, understand the biblical reasons why. God has his part in our finances. We have our part. He won't do ours and we can't do his. And so to not help people understand that, is a big opportunity.
And it sure strikes me, Leif, that there is this connection between thoughtful management in various areas of our lives that allows for generosity in diverse ways. So the Caitlin example, you think about how healthy sort of emotional self-management allows for extra energy to be able to share with others. Effective financial planning, allowing for extra resources to share with others.
Absolutely.
So the sense of taking care of the management of our lives in different areas, creating some bandwidth and margin to be able to partner in generosity with others through these 5 different expressions that have been highlighted.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's John has a question for you. It says, are people who seem to not be giving to the church or non-church organizations, also asking if they are, is it related to a distrust of the church? So where does trust kind of weigh in terms of where you see people giving to churches and other types of organizations?
Yeah, I don't know that I feel comfortable answering that. I don't know that I've got the background to answer that. I'll say from our research that those who were participated in, as you saw on that slide, 84% of millennials said they didn't give to the church. They gave less than 50 to church or non-church nonprofits. So there wasn't a distinction in that respect.
Yeah.
And these were all people in the research that said that faith was important to them and they had attended church. And so I don't know that there was a question in there. I'm pretty certain there wasn't. Relative to, are they not giving because they don't trust the church?
Yeah.
When we, that expression of generosity, financial giving, the data, we didn't draw, well, there's going to be a couple data points between church and non-church, but a lot of times it was just, hey, are you living out generosity? Are you giving financially to church or non-church organizations?
Well, just to remind people, feel free to throw in an additional question, or if you had a question earlier that we didn't catch going back to, feel free to note that again, kind of fresh at the bottom, and would love to get to that. Leif, I know that you get into some of these dynamics in the broader generosity workshop when you have a little more time to unpack things, but just a question that people might be interested in as they think about trying to engage these younger populations in the area of financial giving and these diverse 5 expressions. What's a good starting point for the millennial younger generations to help raise this conversation of generosity to the forefront for them?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that and let me know if I didn't quite hit the mark.
Sure.
And so as we think about these younger generations, we know that their primary expressions of generosity are emotional, relational support, and hospitality. 2 things that the church generally doesn't measure or measure well.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's been one of the bigger ahas for church leaders as they've gone through the workshop, is just that level of awareness, that level of maybe awareness of a blind spot, that in order to reach that next generation, they need to prayerfully think about how are they going to show up in that respect. It's not about just inviting them to serve in the nursery or youth ministry or whatever the case would be. While they want to serve, I think, most people would say they want to be more generous. They're working multiple jobs. And so it's like, how do we, in our unique setting, think about a church leader wrestling with this, how do we, in our unique time and place and setting, meet people where they are in that respect? And then one of them, it was interesting that this was feedback, unsolicited feedback from one of the pastors who went through the workshop. She actually developed a 5-part series off of the content, and she had a fellow pastor actually come and visit the church, and so she asked for her unbiased feedback around how hospitable was the church. And of course, the church itself thought they were done pretty well. This visiting pastor gave her some honest feedback that didn't sit real well, as a church leader, that kind of made her aware that they had maybe a blind spot in that respect. And so I think, as we think about trying to reach those younger generations, think about that definition of hospitality, unqualified acceptance. How hard is that? I mean, personally, as a dad of a 19-year-old, some days it's very difficult. In some of the things he comes up with, and we all probably can laugh about some of those experiences or painfully looking forward to them. But as a church, I grew up in the church, and I know it's much easier to hang out with people that look and talk and act the same way as you do, right? And I think that's a big challenge in front of us and a big opportunity. And that's going to look different from church to church in terms of, how the culture is today and maybe where we want to move it to. It's not going to happen overnight, but I know prayerfully it can happen. And I think that there's a generation waiting for us to meet them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, part of your answer highlights, at least the way I'm kind of hearing it, is allowing different perspectives, different generational perspectives to inform and educate one another. So having that person who understands hospitality speaking into a church and saying, here's what I've experienced around hospitality. And, we talked about the importance of telling stories. I could even see a church saying, well, let's highlight different stories around these different types of 5 expressions. Let's have somebody really good at hospitality tell their stories of hospitality. Let's have somebody who's really good at that emotional relational support tell those stories. Let's have people drawing from these other gift, financial, volunteering, tell their stories. So it takes it from sort of viewing generosity through just one of these lenses to learning from one another. Great emphasis there in that church-based story of hearing from people who understand hospitality. We have another question about sometimes people have this approach to Christian voluntary poverty. And it's noted as potentially, is that an excuse that's used sometime for generosity? And if you have any thoughts about that kind of approach to voluntary poverty becoming an excuse to not give to others.
Interesting. Honestly, I haven't given that a whole lot of thought. I would need to give that a little bit more consideration before I gave a complete answer. Sorry, Elise.
Yeah, it makes sense. And this is not quite the same. So, and I'm sure you have maybe more behind that question, a particular example. I think of some folks that I have met in kind of fairly extreme forms of poverty. I remember walking through a village in Haiti, and literally the person welcoming me into their home had a thatched type roof over their head. And they went way out of their way while I was there with a couple other individuals. They went way out of their way going to the market to get the fresh fish and cooked it for us. And before we left, were serving us this fish that I'm sure cost their family an enormous amount of money. And this state of poverty being a basis for this expression of love and generosity. So poverty and generosity are not always at odds in people's lives, but they can be at times as well. That just is an example that kind of came to my mind from a trip to Haiti one time.
Yeah, that's an excellent example, and as I've had time to give that more considerable thought or more consideration, I think of a story or several stories that some of my colleagues have shared with me as they've traveled internationally with Habitat for Humanity, and just I'll use the word extreme generosity that those local folks show. My colleagues and their teams that have come over there, have taken a week off from work to come and build a house, they're showing extreme generosity from these folks that don't even have, many of the basics that we take for granted every day. And so I think, in America, we know that generosity always costs us something. It can be born out of a sense of scarcity. So I think generosity is a relative term, but I think that we can all do it.
Well, and we've got a kind of a follow-up, a story that was shared about a church that actually does tell lots of examples of giving and stories of ministry impact, and some concerns that have been raised as well. So here's a comment and question for you, Leif. Something I tried to address earlier. Now I just rephrased it. Sorry, may still not be clear. My opinion is generosity is a change of heart. I think that's an interesting phrase there. I like that. So needs to work into people's hearts rather than advertising or telling people to give. My church actually tells stories every week before giving. I personally find it too much, as it almost is like a guilt trip or brainwashing people to give. My family gives away, but we are scared of what they called a prosperity church as we only moved to the U.S. 3 years ago. I think sharing a testimony, I had to scroll down a little bit. Sharing a testimony, encouraging people to give is good, but how do you make it understandable for the congregation about giving? So this, change of heart is a big theme in there, and not using stories to kind of guilt people into giving. So any comments you have around some of those threads as well?
Yeah, great question. A couple of thoughts that come to mind is I would absolutely agree that generosity is born out of a transformed heart. Some of the language that I've used as I've worked with churches in helping them develop their stewardship education ministries is that my vision for them is to actually create a culture of transformational generosity versus transactional generosity. Oftentimes it's very easy to give because we're going to get the parking lot repaved or the boiler went out. Of course, we're going to give to those causes because we're going to get something as a result, whether it be a smoother ride to church or heat on Sunday. So obviously important things to take care of the physical needs. But if that's the only reason people are giving, I think that's a big problem. And it should really be born out of a transformed heart, transformational generosity. There's a comment in there about the prosperity church. I think that's very different than simply communicating impact of giving. That prosperity church comment in there almost makes me think about the give to get, let's do this versus just communicating, hey, there's impact. We as a church organization, as a body of believers, are making an impact on the community. And here's some of the ways that that's showing up. Yeah. If there are some churches that are maybe taking that too far and their messaging is maybe beyond just sharing that encouraging word, then that would be something to be discerning about. But I think hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Well, at this point, I'm going to invite you to say, do you have any final comment? We're going to wrap up here real soon and have a couple quick closing announcements and comments for folks. But any final word you have for our participants today?
I'll just thank you all for participating. This is a journey. And so, I know we're going to send out the resources here afterwards. And I would just invite you on this journey. If you can plug into one of those workshops, you will get more content out of that. And this is a big topic for the church today. And so thanks for participating, and thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Leif. And that website again for folks that are interested.
generosityworkshop.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just to highlight, we welcome your feedback. We want to get your input on these sessions. So if you will be emailing an evaluation your way and would love to get your feedback. Work with Purpose offers a number of resources and events, and we want to highlight some of those in our regional context in San Diego and in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area. An event coming up on October 18th over the lunch hour entitled Encouraging One Another, a Working Women with Purpose lunch. And we have a Bethel Seminary alum and author sharing with us on that day. Register at Bethel's Work with Purpose website. You can find the link available right here. Our next event comes up on November 9th in our Distinguished Lecturer series. And we have Dr. Julie Canlis, who will be joining us, award-winning author and theologian, talking about experiencing God in our ordinary lives. Julie has done work in thinking about a theology of the ordinary. Sometimes we don't always think about the spiritual and theological significance of our lives, Monday to Friday, the ordinary dimensions of our lives. And she'll be helping to guide a conversation around that theology of the ordinary. On October 4th, we have a Women in the Workforce event actually happening at Thrivent Financial in Minneapolis. This is a reception for ministry and marketplace professionals taking place on October 4th at 5 p.m. And come on out to hear these four dynamic panelists who will be guiding that session. We also have in St. Paul on October 16th a workshop that we are thrilled about. We have Pastor Brian Loritz coming to join us for a conversation on faith in the modern workplace. Pastor Brian Loritz is a son of famous pastor Crawford Loritz, and Brian pastors in Silicon Valley, and so is helping to shape people who are engaged in a high-paced, demanding work environment in Silicon Valley, thinking about the priority of whole life discipleship in light of the modern workplace. So come and join us here on Bethel's campus, October 16th, starting at 9 a.m. And registration is available at our events page, bethel.edu/events/2018/faith-workplace. We also want to highlight just a number of great archives available to you at Bethel Seminary's Work with Purpose archive page. A number of key resources. You can hear messages from Ken Blanchard, Amy Sherman, Andy Crouch, and a number of others that have joined us over the years. We try to capture this valuable information and make it available to you. And as you have time and want to draw on that resource, it is available to you at Work with Purpose's archive site. We want to invite you to stay connected with Work with Purpose. You can sign up for our email list, see a full list of the events calendars. Many of the events that have been highlighted to you on the previous slides is going to be available for you there. And for those of you that don't memorize URL online addresses, you can just Google Bethel Seminary Work with Purpose, and it'll bring you to all this valuable information as you can navigate to it on our page. Thank you for coming out and joining us today. It's been a pleasure to hear from Leif Erickson and learn from his wisdom and the wisdom of Thrivent Financial's research with Barna. And we're grateful to have you join us and hear more about this important theme of work with purpose as we pay attention to these areas of whole life discipleship around finance and generosity as well. We're grateful for your time. Thanks for being with us today. Take care.